This is CS146. I'm Matthew Ventures. We just did a crash course in version control, and now we're going to talk about the specific tips on how to use Unity when it comes to version control. The thing to remember, as we touched upon in our last video, is we want to make changes that other people can see if they're working with us on our team, and they can understand what we changed and how to integrate their changes into our changes. That way there is not any problems. What a problem looks like is called basically a merge conflict. And a merge conflict can sometimes be resolved and sometimes it can't be resolved. A merge conflict cannot be resolved when the version control software cannot determine what was changed easily. That is definitely the case with a binary. So you'll call that an unresolvable binary merge conflict. And what happens is these files are not saved, they're saved with a specific binary encoding, which obfuscates what the change was. And because of that, the version control software can't determine the difference. So here's an example. Scene files are binary files. So that means if you change a scene file, so if I were to take this player, okay, the player is a prefab, but if I were to add an empty object to it, I've now changed the scene. And you can see that because there's an asterisk here. So when I push File, Save Scene, Save Project, we're going to see that in the version control software I'm using, the Unity scene has come up as changed. Now, Unity occasionally will spit out some random stuff that we've changed. So the shader recompiled and all of that, really, I don't need. That's not necessarily relevant. So I can remove those changes. I don't need to track those. And it's really up to you whether or not you want to commit those or not. But the one to note here is that I've changed the Unity file. And you're going to notice that for text, for like a code file, here I'll show an example really quick. If I were to change a script, then you'd be able to see the difference in version control. And that's because it has a pretty intuitive understanding of how you've changed that file. Because scripts are really just text files in the end of the day. But this Unity scene, it can't really determine what the difference was. So hopefully this can open up fast. All right, here we are in Visual Studio. And I'm just going to add a little debug statement here. Debug .log. I'm going to say, oh, come on. Hello. All right, so I added a little change there. Pretty simple. And you're going to see in the version control that, all right, so it's spitting out a lot of nonsense. So I'm just going to discard that so we can keep our focus on this stuff. And you probably want to take a look at that just so you can, you only want to commit stuff that you meant to change, right? So if you're a random loading of the shader cache, probably not relevant, right? All right, so you can see if I click this CS file, it's very clear that I added this line. And that's great for programmers because they can understand what the difference was. But if I click the Unity scene file, it's a binary, so right, it says, or it is a binary file. Since it's a binary file, you can't tell the difference, and that's the problem. Okay, so here's how you fix the problem. The way that you fix the problem is you've got two options. The first is you don't change the scene file. All right, easier said than done. At some point, you're going to need to change the scene file. But I found, surprisingly, that there's several companies I've worked for have pretty creative solutions for it. So one company I work for, they have just one item in the scene file called the game manager, okay? And the game manager will load in all the other game objects it needs at start. That way, nobody needs to work within the scene and everything is done programmatically. That's pretty convenient, but it's not really a good fit for every team because sometimes you want to lay out the level design like the Brackeys tutorial did here, and you want to retain that. So if you're going to change the scene, you can only have one person change the scene. So one person at a time needs to be able to change the scene. That way two people don't change it at the same time and you have the conflict. So that's going to require a lot of good communication on your team. And if someone's changing the scene, does that mean that the other person can't make changes at all? Well, not really. They do have other options to them, and one of those is prefabs. So earlier we explored how if I add this game object, I'm changing the scene. But since the scene is really just keeping track of what objects are where, if instead of adding an object, I instead change one of the objects which is already in the scene, then I have the ability to not edit the scene file. Let me show you an example. So let's undo my change here. Discard. Okay, great. Reload. Okay, so now the player is going to have no child. Fine. So we have two options here. If we want the player to have the child game object, we can create an empty game object. All right, we can design it. Let's say this is going to be the child here. Okay, and then we can create that as a prefab. So to create the prefab, as shown in the tutorial, we just drag it down here. Okay, so now I have a prefab child. I can now delete that from the player, so I don't have to change the scene at all. So I can undo any changes I made to the scene. So let me do. So I want to keep the prefab I made, but I'm going to change everything else. So let me just remove that or discard that. Okay. So now I don't have the child game object, but I've got it down here. And I can dynamically load the child from the player script. So that's one option. The other option is to change the prefab, which is probably the most popular option. We can change the prefab, and that way the scene knows a prefab should be there, but we can just change the prefab. So it knows the prefab is going to be there, and then now it's a different prefab. So the scene doesn't change, but we've got the child as we desired. So what that would require is changing the player prefab. So we're going to drop that here. We're going to apply the change. And Unity does not allow nested prefabs, I think, until 2018. And I'm using version 2017. So I'm going to want to make this not a prefab. The child, that is. So let me just delete that. And instead, we're going to have just that game object there. I'm going to apply that as a change to the player prefab. So now, all that we've done is we've changed the player prefab to have a child to it. Now what we can do is, see, you can see that we've changed the player prefab. Now the trick is that's also binary. So unfortunately, if two people are going to now change that, we have an issue. But hopefully you could set up your workflow as a team so that only certain people are working with certain prefabs, even if they're working within the same scene. Okay, and I can see that there was a change to the scene. I don't actually want to change to the scene, so I'm just going to save that. And what I could do is I can discard that change to the scene. So, even though I discarded the change to the scene, I haven't changed the scene at all. I have changed the player. So now the player has the child game object. Okay, so in summary, scene files, as well as prefabs and many other assets you interact with, are going to be unresolvable binaries. That means two people can't change them at once. Otherwise, one of those changes is going to have to stay and one's going to have to go. So someone's work is going to get thrown in the trash, and that sucks. So we're not going to hopefully we don't want that to happen to you, right? So instead, you can either have one person be in charge of the scene and they'll make the changes, or you cannot change the scene at all and have stuff loaded in by script, or you can change stuff at a lower level. So instead of changing the scene, if you have multiple people working on prefabs, like let's say you want to add an explosion to this player character, which is going to be this game object, explosion, whatever, then just change the prefab and don't change the scene. But you're going to run into the same issue with the prefab, right? So you have to be mindful of how you're splitting that up. This is particularly pertinent for GitHub, which allows everybody to kind of access everything at once, or Git rather. Another version control language like Perforce, which you're going to see is a little more popular in game development, allows people to say, I am the owner of a certain thing, and completely block anybody from changing it. So that's pretty useful for a scene, right? Because you can just say, I am the scene owner. No one is allowed to change the scene. And that can help avoid some problems. But Git is a little more loosey-goosey, a little more freedom. So you're going to have to pay a little bit of extra attention to making sure two people don't change the scene or any other unresolvable binary at the same time. Thank you so much. And if you have any trouble with this at all, please just send me an email and let's talk in class. And if you got yourself into a big Git snafu, I'm sure that one of our teaching assistants would be able to help you.